Margaret Tudor was a woman who briefly held the reins of Scotland, yet she was a constant thorn in her brother's side, the King of England, Henry VIII. Her father was Henry VII, the first Tudor king. Her marriages would ultimately prove divisive, as the countries of England and Scotland were forever at each other's throats. So would Margaret live to regret her love of young up-and-coming Scottish lords, or would the spoon she was given at birth prove to be the silver lining she expected? Join me now as we look at the life of Margaret Tudor. She was born at Westminster Palace on the 28th of November 1489 as the eldest daughter and second child of King Henry VII of England and Elizabeth of York. She was named after Margaret Beaufort, the Countess of Richmond and Derby, her paternal grandmother. On the 30th of September 1497, James IV Commissioner, the Spaniard Pedro de Ayala, concluded a lengthy truce with England, the Treaty of Perpetual Peace, which was signed by James and Henry in 1502. It agreed to end the intermittent warfare between Scotland and England, which had been waged over the previous 200 years, and as a part of the treaty, a marriage was agreed between James and Margaret Tudor, Henry's daughter. For now, though, Margaret would remain in England, but was now known as the Queen of Scots. In May 1503, James IV confirmed her possession of lands and houses in Scotland. These included Methven Castle, Stirling, Doune, Linlithgow Palace and Newark Castle, with the incomes from the corresponding earldom and lordship lands. Later that same year, just months after the death of her mother, Margaret came to Scotland. Her progress was a grand journey northward. She left Richmond Palace on the 27th of June with Henry VII, and they travelled first to Collyweston in Northamptonshire. At York, a plaque commemorates the exact spot where the Queen of Scots entered its gates, and after crossing the border at Berwick-upon-Tweed on the 1st of August 1503, Margaret was met by the Scottish court at Lamberton. It would be on the 8th of August 1503 Margaret had reached the ripe old age of 14 that marriage was celebrated in person in Holyrood Abbey. The rites were performed by the Archbishop of Glasgow and Thomas Savage, the Archbishop of York. 2 days later, on St Lawrence's Day, Margaret went to Mass at St Giles as her first public appointment. By her marriage contract, Margaret was allowed a household with 24 English courtiers, or servants. Some of her ladies-in-waiting had been members of the household of Elizabeth of York, but one of these servants was Harry Roper. He worked in the wardrobe, making her sheets, washing clothes, and mending her tapestries and perfuming them with a violet powder. As for the marriage, well, Margaret and James had 6 children, of which only one survived infancy. But this was James, who would go on to become King James V of Scotland. Customs at the time were an integral part of Margaret's reign. One she would perform was on Maundy Thursday. It was the custom for the monarch and consort to give gifts to the poor and symbolically wash their feet. And so on the 4th of April 1504, she gave 15 poor women blue gowns, shoes, a purse with 15 English pennies, and a wooden tankard with a jug and a plate. This was a token of the Last Supper. The number of poor women matched her age at the time. Another custom of the time was to give presents on New Year's Day, and in 1507 it said that James IV gave Margaret a serpent's tongue, which was set in gold with precious stones, which was believed to guard against poison. But by 1513 the giving of gifts now included 8 ladies of her chamber, who each received a gold ring. These were made by John Aitken, a goldsmith, who had resided at Stirling Castle. By 1507, Margaret was now setting off on tours across the country. She travelled to East Lothian, accompanied by her ladies and court musicians, but her travels and music would soon be abruptly interrupted. In 1509, after the death of Henry VII, a young successor would come to the throne in England, her brother, Henry VIII. This caused much concern for the Scots in respect of the treaty which was signed some years earlier. But it didn't stop Henry setting out to war with France, Scotland's historic ally. This would culminate in 1513 when Margaret's husband, James IV, invaded England to honour his commitment to the Old Alliance, but only to meet disaster and death at the Battle of Flodden. Although Margaret had always been opposed to the war, luckily for her, she had still been named within the royal will as regent to their infant and now new King of Scotland, James V. But all this came with a caveat, stating her role as regent would only stay in place if she remained single. Not long after the Battle of Flodden, Margaret was named regent. This was at the time a rarity for a woman to hold such power, and more so in this case as Margaret was the sister of the enemy king. It wouldn't be long before a pro-French party started to gain momentum among the Scottish nobility. They urged that she should be replaced and that John Stewart, the 2nd Duke of Albany, the closest male relative to the infant prince, should in fact now take control. Albany, who was born and bred in France, was seen as a living representative to the old alliance. This was not how Margaret saw the situation. She, with some degree of political skill and composure, set about healing the rifts, and by July 1514 she had reconciled the opposing parties to the point where Scotland and France were once again at peace with England. Yet it would be her search for political allies amongst the fractious Scottish nobility she took a fatal step. After allowing good sense and prudence to be overruled by emotion, she came across Archibald Douglas, the 6th Earl of Angus, who was waiting in the wings. The powerhouse of the Douglas family, and in particular Archibald, who was called a young witless fool by his uncle, somehow found an attraction for Margaret. She became attached and fell in love with this new man in her life, and the couple were eventually married in secret on the 6th of August 1514. Quite possibly not the most prudent of steps to take, as by terms of the late King's will, if she remarried she would have to give up the regent of Scotland, and this happened. Within a month John Stewart quickly stepped in to replace her. And yet more bad news was to follow. In September, the Privy Council stated that she no longer had any rights to her son and that all supervision would be taken away from her. In a rage, she gathered some allies and her son and left for Stirling Castle. Then just 2 months later, in November, Margaret penned a letter to her brother, King Henry, in England. She explained that all future letters written by her own hand would have the signature of Margaret R, and from that he would know that they were genuine. That other letters received by him not signed this way could be a part of a band of enemies now hoping to bring her down and, in her eyes, kidnap her son. In May 1515, Albany had taken control and was now installed as regent. His initial task was to gain hold of Margaret's boys, James and Alexander, but Alexander died on the 18th of December that year. But at the time both were essential for him to claim the authority he needed as regent. Margaret had little options left, and after some initial defiance, she surrendered at Stirling in August. With the princess now in the hands of their uncle, the only thing left for Margaret was to concentrate, at least for the time being, on the birth of her next child by her husband, Angus. For some time her brother Henry had been urging her to flee to England with her sons, but her fear of her son James not gaining the Scottish throne had always prevented her in taking this step. However, once Margaret's 2 sons were in the custody of their uncle, Margaret secretly accepted her brother's offer of her personal safety at the English court, but she was still pregnant with Angus's child, and she was also in great fear of her life under the rule of the Privy Council of Scotland. But even now, as Queen Dowager, she was still forced to beg permission from the council just to travel. The permission eventually arrived and she was granted leave to Linlithgow Palace, where it was said she would give birth. But this was the opportunity Margaret wanted, and instead of going to Linlithgow, she escaped to Tantallon Castle and then via Blackadder Castle and Coldstream Priory, finally crossing the border into England. Margaret was received by Thomas Dacre, Henry's warden of the Marches, and taken to Harbottle Castle in Northumberland. There, in early October, she gave birth to Lady Margaret Douglas, the future Countess of Lennox and mother of Henry Stewart, Lord Darnley, who was cousin and second husband to Mary Queen of Scots and father of the future James VI. It was while she stayed in the north of England that Margaret heard about the death of her younger son Alexander. It had been hinted that Albany was responsible. Yet Margaret, even in her vulnerable state, refused to accept this, saying that if he really aimed at securing the throne for himself, the death of James would have better suited his purpose. It was also at this time that she at last began to get the measure of Angus, who, with an eye on his own welfare, returned to Scotland to make peace with the regent. But when Henry VIII learned that Angus would not be accompanying his sister to London, he said, "Done like a Scot." The problem for Angus was that all his wealth and even his influence was tied up in Scotland, so if he failed to gain favour again from the Scottish hierarchy, he risked the possibility of forfeiture, and that would ultimately lead to treason. Margaret, now alone, travelled south to London and was warmly welcomed by King Henry. She stayed at Scotland Yard, which at the time was the royal residence for Scottish kings. Just 1 year later, in 1517, Margaret returned north after a treaty of reconciliation had been worked out by Albany, Henry and Cardinal Wolsey. Albany was temporarily absent in France when he renewed the old alliance once more and had made arrangements for a future marriage for Margaret's son, James. When Margaret arrived at the border, she was met by her husband, Angus, and although initial pleasantries were offered, it would not take long for their marriage to decline. Margaret had discovered that while she was in England, Angus had been living with Lady Jane Stewart, her former lover. The cheating was bad, but made worse by the fact the couple were living off Margaret's money. In October 1518, she wrote to her brother, hinting at divorce.
I am sore troubled with my Lord of Angus since my last coming into Scotland, and every day more and more, so that we have not been together this half year. I am so minded that, and I may by law of God and to my honour, to part with him, for I wit well he loves me not, as he shows me daily.
Back in England, Henry was now troubled at the recent events playing out north of the border. He was opposed to divorce, and quite ironic for a man whose future beliefs would impact his own marital status later in life. Yet Angus was a useful ally and an effective counterweight to Albany and the pro-French faction. But all this talk angered Margaret. She called for Albany to return to Scotland, but he refused and said she should now take the role as regent. But these latest developments did little to solve the problem of her marriage with Angus, and the ongoing dispute continued for a further 3 years. It became more complicated and feuding began between Angus and James Hamilton, the first Earl of Arran. Margaret was now dizzy. She had no idea which side to join, often siding with one before switching to the other. In November 1521, Albany finally arrived back in Scotland and was warmly received by Margaret. It was soon rumoured that their cordial relations embraced more than just politics. Angus went into exile while the regent, with the full cooperation of the Queen Dowager, set about restoring order to a country riven by 3 years of intense factional conflict. Margaret had uses for Albany. He was said to have influence in Rome, which hopefully would sort her problem of marriage to Angus and gain her the divorce she wanted. Yet Angus and his allies spread the rumour that both Margaret and Albany were lovers, to such effect that even the sober-headed Lord Dacre wrote to Wolsey, predicting that James would be murdered and Albany would become king and marry Margaret. However, the newly formed relationship wasn't what it seemed. The two of them at heart had only self-preservation at the forefront of their minds, as upcoming events would show. Although Margaret had tried in vain to solve her problems and act in the best way a Scottish regent should, her heart and outlook always focused on her homeland of England. She desired a better understanding between the two nations and now looked for an alliance, as going back to the bloody days of border wars with England would neither help her cause or anyone else's. Albany was now once again in France, so Margaret took hold of the ropes and formed her own party. It would be in 1524 that the regent was removed, and with help from Arran and the Hamiltons, Margaret brought James, her son, now 12 years old, back to Edinburgh. This was a bold and popular move. As for Albany, he never returned to Scotland and died in 1536. In August, Parliament declared the regency at an end and James was elevated to full kingly powers. In practice, he would continue to be governed by others, his mother above all. After objections, it was finally formalised that Margaret would become the chief counsellor to the upcoming King James. Margaret's alliance inevitably alienated other noble houses, yet she formed a new attachment, this time to Henry Stewart, a younger brother of Lord Avondale. Stewart was promoted to senior office, angering the Earl of Lennox, among others, who promptly entered into an alliance with her estranged husband Angus, who would not go away. When Margaret had been confirmed through Parliament in November as chief, Angus rode to Edinburgh with a large group of men and stated a claim to enter Parliament. But Margaret this time drew on powers that would send repercussions through the court. She engaged guns from both the castle and Holyrood House to fire, but this didn't go well. 2 English ambassadors were staying with her at the time, but her words of defiance were swift, and she told them to go home and not meddle in Scottish affairs. Angus backed away, but he would be back. Pressure was placed on Margaret that she should allow him back, and this actually occurred in February 1525. For Angus, it was a success, so much so he not only gained access but took custody of James and refused to give him up for the next 3 years. For James, his continued growth would lead to an abiding hatred of both the House of Douglas and now the English. It was now a time of new political realities. Margaret tried to resist but was eventually broken, and now her long-suffering divorce from Angus was becoming more obsessive, and it was one that would take precedence over everything else. Anything, though, would now suffice to remove once and for all the husband she deeply despised. Finally, in March 1527, Pope Clement VII granted her petition, although the political situation in Europe held up the announcement, and it would eventually be in December that she learned of her good fortune. The following year, on the 3rd of March 1528, she married Henry Stewart and ignored the warning from Cardinal Wolsey that the marriage was divinely ordained, along with the protests against the shameless sentence sent from Rome. By June 1528, James managed to free himself of Angus and now began to rule the country, while Angus once again fled into exile. For Margaret, this was an early reward, for now both herself and new husband were emerging as the leading advisors to the king. But Stewart had himself a much darker side, and one in which Margaret would yet again come to regret. The main aim for Margaret had always been to provide harmony between Scotland and England, and not forgetting her own self-preservation along the way. Her son James, though, was suspicious of Henry, especially because of his support for Angus, a man he loathed with a passion. Even so, in early 1536, his mother persuaded him to meet with her brother. This would become her moment of triumph, or so she thought. Yet after spending huge sums of money and creating an occasion like no other, it all came to nothing due to concerns and objections raised. She spoke privately with an English ambassador and confessed, "I am weary of Scotland." Being weary for a country was one thing, being weary of yet another husband whose only interests were other women and spending her money were not at all the things she wanted to confront again. But she was once again eager for divorce, but proceedings were frustrated by James, whom she believed her husband had bribed. As so often in Margaret's life, suffering and unhappiness were closely pursued by intrigue and farce. At one point she ran away towards the border, only to be intercepted and brought back to Edinburgh, but she continued writing letters to Henry for help, claiming her poverty and needing protection, and to stop from feeling obliged to follow her son around like a poor gentlewoman. So Henry decided in the goodness of his heart to send her £200 and a parcel of luxury fabrics. The fabric was for costume to wear at her son's wedding to Madeleine of Valois. The marriage was arranged as a condition of the Treaty of Rouen, and James was originally to be betrothed to another bride, but he preferred Madeleine. They married, but her health, which had been poor since birth, failed, and she died 6 months after the wedding. It would be the last time Henry would support his sister. In June 1538, Margaret welcomed Mary of Guise, James's second French bride, to Scotland. The two of them were Scotland's most formidable in Scottish history, and immediately hit it off together. Mary made sure that Margaret would now be able to make regular visits to court to see and speak with her most protected and valuable asset, that of her son, now King James V. On the 18th of October 1541, Margaret died at Methven Castle. It was reported that she had palsy, possibly resulting from a stroke on the Friday, and without fully recovering, she died on the following Tuesday. Although Margaret never doubted she would make a full recovery, she made no will, so a message was sent to King James, who was at Falkland Palace, but his arrival was too late. Near the end, she wished that the friars who attended her would seek the reconciliation of the king and the Earl of Angus. She hoped the king would give her possessions to her daughter, Lady Margaret Douglas. When James did finally arrive, he ordered Oliver Sinclair and John Tennant to pack up her belongings for his use. She was buried at the Carthusian Charter House in Perth. This building no longer exists, as it was demolished during the Reformation of 1559. Margaret's life was hectic, often at a level that was difficult to understand. She had no education, next to no religion, and she was guided by her own instincts, which in most cases fell far below what was expected of a woman of her standing. She was betrothed at just 6 years old to a man in his 20s. Obviously, this was not done for love, but for the power and the treaty of perpetual peace. It's a drama you really couldn't make up. Her role as regent was a tough learning curve for Margaret. She had some minor political gains in helping to bring peace to the three fighting nations, yet on a personal level her marriages all ended badly. Most of her misdeeds and in fact misfortune were attributed to her personal conduct. She wanted the power and glory and as much gold as she could get in her purse. Margaret probably tried too hard. She tried to help her children, she tried to help in international peace efforts, yet in the main it was just a succession of failures. For Margaret Tudor's indulgence and selfish passions, she left more questions than answers. She was inferred to as evil for taking divorce and something that was frowned upon at the time. And the final words come from her brother Henry VIII. When he heard of Margaret's attempt to divorce, he is quoted as saying, "It was impossible for anyone to live a more shameful life than Margaret." This is certainly a case of the pot calling the kettle black. Margaret learnt the hard way. As for Henry's future wives, they would also come to understand the role expected, and as Margaret, they never really stood a chance. Thank you so much for watching, I really appreciate it. For more amazing stories, join me today and benefit by subscribing. Oh, and check out both the videos coming up on the screen right now. And I'll see you again soon here on the History Roadshow.